sure somewhere on the front line, a Ukrainian platoon has captured a trench line. A Ukrainian company has fought their way through to a piece of critical terrain. But everything that they're capturing is still in the gray crumple zone of the Russian defenses. That area of flexible defense designed to absorb a Ukrainian attack. They haven't reached the first primary defensive line of a Russian defensive network that has three major defensive lines. And what they don't say, I mean, yes, we get the telegram channels, we get, the Ukrainians advancing here, taking 3 buildings here, taking something here. But for the most part, after they file that report, what they don't say is that the Russians immediately hit those Ukrainian troops with glide bombs, 500 kilogram glide bombs, with artillery, with the TOS-1 and TOS-2 flamethrower system, thermobaric weaponry that literally sucks the lungs out of its victims, and slaughters the Ukrainians that are there, making the people that have occupied that territory either die, they get wounded, or they have to retreat. The Ukrainians are achieving nothing other than massive death and destruction. Any territory they've gained is usually given back to the Russians, or is so useless in the overall scheme of things that Russia says, keep it for now, we'll just kill you tomorrow. Well, clearly the nations are saying they want to support Zelensky, and there's efforts underway to get more military support to Zelensky. The problem is there's just not enough military equipment, and Ukraine's run out of trained manpower. The Ukrainian army today is the strongest it's going to be. It will never be as strong as it is today, and today they're going to lose 800 to 1,000 soldiers dead on the battlefield, another 2,000 soldiers wounded. Those soldiers can't be replaced with trained manpower. So tomorrow Ukraine will be weaker. Tomorrow Ukraine will be as strong as it'll ever be, because the day after that it's going to get weaker. And every day that follows, the Ukrainian army is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And there's nothing Zelensky can do to change that reality. So he's confronted with the fact that sooner rather than later, the Ukrainian military is going to collapse in the face of a superior Russian military force. And so, yes, there is the desperation right now. He's desperate to get international intervention. And this is why he's, demanding to become part of NATO. He wants to get that Article 5 protection, but NATO is not willing to commit suicide for Ukraine. And, this is the biggest, not the biggest, because I have zero sympathy for Zelensky, but, you do have to feel for a man who is responsible for the destruction of his nation. And now he's waking up to the fact that it's over and there's nothing he can do to resolve the situation. And he will forever go down in history as the man who destroyed Ukraine. I have to ask Zelensky to recheck his chronology. I remember that at the Ramstein contact group in Ukraine contact group that was held in Ramstein, Germany back in October, General Zaluzhny said, if you want us to carry out a counteroffensive, we need hundreds of tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, unlimited ammunition, aircraft, everything. And then in the months that followed, NATO struggled on whether or not they were going to provide the Leopard tanks, the Martyrs, and et cetera. But it began in October. But even if the equipment had been provided instantly, you'd still have to train the people on this equipment, et cetera, so that the earliest this offensive could have began would have been in March or April. But the weather, the Rasputitsa, the muddy season is there, so you can't do the offensive until the weather clears up. So Zelensky is lying, straight up lying. Because the other thing that is that once the Russians began their partial mobilization back in October, similar time frame, they immediately began digging these networks. These trench systems were dug and prepared over the fall and early winter and fully manned with trained personnel by spring. So at no time was there a situation where Zelensky was sitting on a potent counterattacking force when the Russians had no defensive capability. The Russians have always had a defensive capability. Zelensky has only recently acquired a counterattack force. And so again, this is political spin that has nothing to do with reality. Ukraine has been talking up for some time now about the potential of a nuclear catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in a vain effort to get the international community to intervene, to come in and take control of the plant, to create a demilitarized zone around it, under the belief that those international parties who created this international zone would be comprised of people from nations who recognized Ukraine as the rightful sovereign of this territory. Therefore, this territory would become Ukraine again. That's what the Ukrainians want. They want to kick the Russians out and get this back. Russia's not playing that game. Russia will not yield. This territory is now legally, from the Russian perspective, constitutionally, part of Russia, and therefore can never be yielded back to Ukraine or any third-party international peacekeeping force. This is never going to happen. Zelensky's in a situation right now where he's losing, and you can't spin your way out of this reality. The reality is, Ukraine has lost this war, and the only hope Ukraine has is on international intervention. And this whole concept of attacking Zaporizhzhia, the Russians blowing it up, the Russians claiming a false flag from Ukraine, has been Ukrainian propaganda. It will never happen, and the reason why is that Ukraine could never get away with it. To create a nuclear incident, it's the most easily forensically investigated incident imaginable. Once you put radioactive particles on the ground, science kicks in, and you'll be able to trace the particles back to their point of origin. You can't hide where it came from. It's just stupid in the extreme, and I never believed Ukraine was going to do this. I always believed that this was a propaganda ploy to get NATO interested in discussing potential scenarios of intervention. But it's failed because, remember, it was supposed to take place on the 5th of July. Didn't happen, never will happen. I mean, the Western media has created an alternative reality, a narrative that says that Russia is a brutal aggressor who invaded Ukraine without justification, that Ukraine is bravely defending its soil from the deprivations of, the evil dictator Vladimir Putin, and that the sacrifice is necessary to preserve, this bastion of European democracy that stands as a shining symbol to everybody.
But Scott, what kind of democracy is that? Is not willing to have any election in Ukraine. What kind of democracy is this?
You remember I said this was a narrative that's being spun, which means it's manufactured, it's fake. Every aspect of it's fake, but it's being sold to an unquestioning audience in the West, especially here in America, and in many places of Europe, where they simply, because they're so far removed from the reality, they're easily led to accepting at face value anything the media says about the situation in Ukraine. And unfortunately, the only way that they're ever going to be compelled to change their mind is when you can't tell the lie anymore because there's nothing to lie about, meaning Ukraine will be destroyed, will be annihilated. And when that happens, these people will be left to reflect on how it happened and why it happened. And one of the main reasons is that their ignorance allowed Ukraine to continue down this path towards national suicide that could have been ended at any time. Whereas Ukraine has walked away from negotiations, I think we need to understand that Russia has been seeking a negotiated end to this fight from the very beginning. They tried to avoid a conflict, by trying to get the Minsk Accords to be implemented, B, when that failed, by trying to get the United States and NATO to agree to discuss a treaty for the new European security framework. When that got rejected, they attempted bilateral negotiations with Ukraine to stop this. Up until the moment Putin ordered troops across, the Russians were still trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. And then once the war started, people now know that Russia's goal wasn't to defeat Ukraine, to occupy Ukraine, but to get Ukraine back to the negotiating table. which Russia succeeded in doing. 3 meetings in Gomel, Belarus, followed by several meetings in Turkey, where the Ukrainians initialed a draft treaty that would have ended the war had they attended the signing ceremony in Istanbul, scheduled for April 1st of 2022. Had they gone there, Kherson would be Ukrainian today. Zaporizhia would be Ukrainian today, including the nuclear power plant. Donetsk and Donbass would be independent, but they would be called upon to carry out a referendum on where they want to go. And this would give Ukraine a chance to make the argument that they should remain part of Ukraine. Crimea would stay Russia, but Crimea has been Russia since 2014. Some people argue that it's always been Russia. But more importantly, 350,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be alive today. 20 million Ukrainians displaced from their homes would have homes. Children who otherwise would have stable family environments, going to school, getting an education, wouldn't be scattered around the world. Many of them orphans now, all of them doomed to an uncertain future. The Russians have sought a peaceful resolution to this problem of negotiated settlement. And it's been Ukraine that said no. And now that the reality is hitting home, I don't think the Russians are in the mood to negotiate. I think Russia's in the business of never again allowing itself to be used by disingenuous players in Ukraine and the West. Remember, Minsk Accords. We now know that the former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, viewed them as a sham, simply to buy time to build a Ukrainian army capable of liberating the Donbass and Crimea. And Poroshenko was supported in this by Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and by Francois Hollande, the French president, who signed the Minsk Accords, and who were supposed to be pressuring Ukraine to fully implement it. But they both agreed, no, this was a sham. We were just buying time. The only honest broker at the table was the Russians, and they were the ones who got put out. How could Russia ever trust a Western negotiator again after that? How could Russia? So I don't think Russia's in the business of trying to allow the West and Ukraine to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, to get through negotiation what could not be gotten through the battlefield. Russia sacrificed too many men, too much material, too much national treasure to finish short of the ultimate objective of demilitarization, the destruction of the Ukrainian army. And I think that's the direction we're heading. Russia will destroy the Ukrainian army. Putin has presented the signed documents of the peace treaty that was being negotiated with Ukraine when an African delegation from 7 African nations showed up in Russia seeking to, get Russian acquiescence on an African peace plan. Putin put the treaty out there for the first time and said, here, it's signed. 18 annexes discussing everything. We had an agreement. This war could have ended, but it was Ukraine that walked away. There's no doubt about it. I would ask the journalist that you spoke to, maybe you can ask him the next time you speak, would he have preferred that Putin carry out a war of aggression against Ukraine, occupy the Ukrainian capital, lose unbelievable numbers of Russian lives, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, only to get bogged down in a conflict that would require general mobilization of Russia, disrupt Russian economic recovery, cripple the Russian economy, and create a tremendous amount of domestic unrest in Russia. Is that what he wants? And the right answer is he doesn't know what he wants, to be honest. Just simply doesn't know what he wants because he doesn't understand the scope and scale of the problem. Or he's a Navalny supporter who wants that because he wants to bring down the Putin government. What Vladimir Putin did is put it together a military operation designed. It was called a special military operation for a reason. It was designed to get Ukraine to return to the negotiating table, and it succeeded. It succeeded. It was a successful military operation. But because politics is an extension, war is politics, by any other means, the Ukrainians backed out. And then Russia was compelled to change course. And you could be critical of Putin to say, why didn't he anticipate this betrayal? Why didn't he anticipate that? And that's a question that maybe someday he'll answer. But he's already answered it. He spoke to the wives of Russian soldiers, deployed Russian soldiers who have died, and he apologized to them. He said the biggest mistake he made was accepting the Minsk Accords in 2014. He said, I could have destroyed the Ukrainian military right then, and it'd be all over. We wouldn't be having this conversation. I could have ended it all right then. But when I was asked by the French and the Germans if to pursue peace, I went along with it because I believed that they would actually try to get a peaceful outcome. He was lied to. And so he said, I'll never again make that mistake, which means he'll never again make that mistake. He'll never again trust the West to do the right thing because the West is only capable of doing the wrong thing when it comes to Russia. Back in 1993, George Soros wrote an article about the future of NATO. And he made a couple observations. One was that in order to exist, NATO would need an enemy, and that enemy, of course, would have to be Russia, because only Russia provided an opponent of the size necessary to justify continued defense spending on the level needed to sustain an organization like NATO. But he made the point that NATO couldn't fight Russia. Not because it couldn't get the military capability to do so, but because a war with Russia would cause lots of body bags to come home to NATO countries. And most NATO nations just would not accept the level of death and destruction that would come with a war with Russia. So he said the best thing that can happen for NATO is for them to lure in Eastern European nations under the promise of eventually becoming a NATO member, but never allowing them to join. But because they want to become NATO members so much, they're willing to offer up Eastern European manpower that can then be married up with NATO technology to confront Russia, bring pain to Russia. And the good thing about this equation was that no NATO body bags were coming home, that NATO was sacrificing East Europeans to do its bidding. Now, when I first read this, it sickened me. It sickened me even more when Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for, I believe she writes for The Atlantic now, echoed Soros's theory in a recent article about the Ukraine conflict. But to hear the Ukrainian defense minister embrace this notion as something positive just shows how depraved the Ukraine government is, and how unworthy they are of being able to govern over the Ukrainian people whom they're sacrificing by the hundreds of thousands. And it's also how depraved NATO is. What person that can call themselves human would allow this to happen? And more than that, I mean, I say this part as a Marine, and I know there's a lot of people out there that get a little angry when I put on my Marine hat, but hey, it is what it is. Be a man. You want to fight? Fight. You think you can take on Russia? Take on Russia. Put your own people in the field. If you're an American, put the American Army in the field. Put the Marine Corps in the field. We're the best after all. What are you afraid of? Why don't you put your own people in the field? Why don't you, put your money where your mouth is, so to speak? But they don't because they're cowards. Not the soldiers. It's not their fault. But the people who lord over them, the politicians who have made a concerted decision to avoid losing their own resources and a willingness to sacrifice the lives of others, not because we care about those people, but because we want a broader policy objective of weakening Russia. We're willing to sacrifice Ukraine and Ukrainians to weaken Russia, but we're not willing to do that by using our own flesh and blood, which tells you then that this isn't really an important objective, because if it was truly an important objective, we would put our forces on the ground. we're killing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians on a lark, on a whim. And that's deeply disturbing.
Before this war started, the mindset in the West was the sanctions gonna crush down Russia. But now we are seeing that in Europe, in France, there is a lot of riots. People are not happy with the situation there. How did it play out for Europeans?
Well, I think you and I have had this conversation before. When I predicted, I said in the summer of 2023, there's going to be revolutionary change going through Europe, that the elected officials who got Europe in this war are going to have a hard time holding on to power. Now, I can't predict the future, and I have to be honest with you. While I find it ironic that Macron, who sought to destroy the Russian economy and bring suffering to the Russian people through economic sanctions, to kill Russian soldiers on the battlefield, is now, suffering at home. On the one hand, it's like, yeah, that's karma. But on the other hand, I'm somebody who's been to France. I love France. It's a great nation, interesting people, a tremendous culture, beautiful. And I don't wish this on France at all. The other thing we have to recognize, too, is that much of the problems that are manifesting themselves in France today have nothing to do directly with the Ukrainian conflict and everything to do with French immigration policy and the inability of France to integrate these minority communities and therefore making them feel to be, inferior, treated disproportionately poor by the police. This started with what appeared to be the execution of a 17-year-old. I know people will say he was driving recklessly and da-da-da. It's not a death penalty, but he was killed because a cop pulled a gun, pointed his head, and pulled the trigger. That's why these riots are taking place. So, you can't say that France is the standard upon which the rest of Europe will follow. Although one would say that the unrest in France is probably also predicated by growing public discontent over the economic situation in France, the lack of opportunities. And that's brought on by the fact that France can't afford the socialist type system that it has built for itself because it's going bankrupt because of the war in Ukraine. So there is indirect relationship there. Germany is becoming a deindustrialized state. That's not me saying that. That's a German think tank coming out and saying, yeah, we're deindustrializing ourselves. Germany is looking at economic collapse square in the face. So is England. It's an economy in recession. Nothing's working for the British. So they're going down. They've already had, Boris Johnson, Truss, and now they're into, their third prime minister. So in a way that is, representative of some sort of political decay in Great Britain. And we don't know how long Richie Sunak's going to last, when he's going to fail, when he's going to collapse. What we do know is the British right now are in a death spin whose trajectory takes them to the ground, not to the air. And we can go down through NATO and just look at all the different NATO countries, all the G7 countries, and the fact that none of them are better off today than they were before the war started. Whereas Russia, you can make the case that Russia is not only better off today economically than they were when the war started, but that the Russian economy is the healthiest it's been ever. And one of the reasons why I make that statement is that prior to the sanctions, the Russian oligarchs were making money in Russia, but that money was leaving Russia, fleeing Russia, being invested outside of Russia, wasn't being reinvested into Russia. But now, thanks to sanctions, this money is still being made. But what do you do with it? You can't take it to Monaco. You can't take it to, Nice, Saint-Tropez, London. You have to reinvest it into Russia. And so there's this tremendous amount of reinvestment, which then creates this economic engine of growth, new businesses, making money. The money can't flee, so it's reinvested. Growth. And this growing Russian economy is now becoming increasingly attractive to the world, especially Asia. And you see a lot of Indian, Japanese, Chinese companies starting to invest heavily into Russia. So the sanctions have failed egregiously. It's backfired tremendously, and people don't know what to do. I mean, I think the Europeans are starting to say, yes, sanctions haven't worked, and yet they just passed, the 17th round of sanctions. And the same thing with the United States. We know it's not working. Senator Angus King, the ostensible independent senator from the state of Maine, held a hearing where he, bemoaned the fact that the sanctions haven't worked, it backfired. And he wants to know how that happened, why that happened. Well, because you don't know anything about Russia. When you put together sanctions, which are designed to be a solution to a problem, if you haven't defined the problem correctly, then the solution doesn't work. It's a solution to nothing, oftentimes making the situation even more dire for the people who started it. And right now, the United States and Europe are facing economies in crisis because of the blowback from their sanctioning of Russia.